The new maps, 10 countries that should not exist anymore. The lie the map told you. Look at the map you grew up with. The one that sat on your classroom wall or inside that dusty old atlas, bright, neat, divided into tidy shapes with names printed across them in bold. Every border was clean, every country looked permanent, but here's the thing, that map is already lying to you. Some of those lines don't match the world anymore. Some of those colors, those countries, are fading out, splitting apart, or sinking beneath the waves, and most people haven't even noticed. Because maps whisper a false promise that the world is static, that nations last forever, that the page won't change. But right now, as you listen, there are governments collapsing from the inside. There are entire populations preparing to leave lands that soon won't exist. There are borders being erased not by war but by water. The map is alive, and it's quietly redrawing itself while everyone still points at drawings that died years ago. Here's the strange truth. Our planet decides more than politics ever will. Mountains, rivers, oceans, they dictate the boundaries of power far more than kings or constitutions. And when geography turns against you, no law can save you. The world is full of countries born from accidents of terrain and history, held together by habit, bureaucracy, or hope. But some of those bonds are unraveling right now. Over the next few minutes, we're pulling back the curtain on 10 of them. The fragile nations that geography, climate, or sheer structural design have already marked for collapse. Not all at once. Some will dissolve slowly, like Belgium's uneasy patchwork of languages. Others, like the Maldives or Tuvalu, will vanish physically, their lands swallowed by the ocean. And some, like Yemen or Iraq, will be torn apart because the ground beneath them hides something worth fighting for. This isn't a list born from speculation or conspiracy. It's about cold physics, warm air, mountain ranges, and melting seas. It's about what happens when the natural world stops cooperating with the political one. Because while we argue over elections and treaties, the Earth is drawing new lines with its own hand. You can already see the cracks forming if you look closely. A language border running through Brussels. Coastlines where whole villages are carried away by storms. Rivers that decide who gets to drink and who gets to fight. Satellite images showing cities drying out or drowning. History repeating itself with different flags. Our maps make it look like we control this planet. But look long enough and you realize we're just tenants, temporary guests renting space on a restless sphere that constantly rearranges itself. Every empire thought it was permanent, until the land, the climate, or the people decided otherwise. So maybe it's time to stop asking who draws the borders and start asking what does. Because across the next 10 stories you'll see a pattern. Nations collapsing not because their people failed, but because their geography did. These aren't doomsday prophecies. They're warnings already written on coastlines, fault lines, and faulted governments. 10 countries standing on the edge of their own maps. 10 places whose existence is being renegotiated by the forces underneath, around, and above them. The map you know is already history. The real one, the new one, is still unfolding, quietly, dangerously, one erased border at a time. Belgium, the country too complicated to survive. The story of Belgium begins not with a revolution or a grand declaration, but with a compromise, a stitched-together arrangement designed to keep stronger neighbors happy. In 183, when the Netherlands grew too Protestant and too Dutch for the people living just south, Europe's powers created something new, a small bilingual buffer between France and Germany. It was convenient, it was temporary, and somehow it lasted almost 2 centuries. But cracks run through Belgium's foundation like fault lines. To the north lies Flanders, Dutch-speaking, industrious, tightly organized. To the south is Wallonia, French-speaking, post-industrial, slower to recover from the decline of coal and steel. And right in the middle literally is Brussels, a bilingual capital that answers to both but truly belongs to neither. 3 languages, 3 economies, 3 versions of what Belgium even means. By 2025, those cultural fractures have hardened into political ones. Flemish nationalism isn't just a slogan anymore, it's an administrative agenda. The N-VA, led by Bart de Wever, built their campaign on a simple frustration. Why should the North, with its higher GDP and lower unemployment, keep subsidizing the poorer South? On paper, Belgium is a federal state. In reality, it's a reluctant roommate situation where each floor of the house has locked its own door. Flanders hums with productivity, its ports connecting Europe's manufacturing spine. Wallonia struggles under persistent unemployment. Brussels, fluent in 4 bureaucracies and 1,000 diplomatic acronyms, pretends to mediate while the plumbing between the regions rusts. Every budget meeting becomes an argument about who owes whom. Every election feels like a rehearsal for divorce court. The irony is brutal. Belgium hosts the headquarters of the European Union and NATO, the beating heart of international cooperation, while internally it can barely cooperate with itself. Inside that elegant capital of council meetings and treaties, the national government sometimes goes without formation for months, even years. The record still stands, 541 days between elections and a working coalition. For a democracy, that's not governance, it's paralysis. One could argue that Belgium's greatest export now isn't chocolate or beer, but gridlock. And lately, even Europe is starting to wonder what happens if this small experiment in compromise finally runs out of patience. Let's talk numbers. Flanders, with about 6 million people, generates far more economic output than Wallonia's 6 million. GDP per capita in the north sits around 43,800 euros. In the south, just 30,700 euros. The imbalance shapes everything from job markets to schools to the quiet resentment of who pays what. Flanders, proud and prosperous, looks north and west to the Netherlands and Germany. Wallonia gazes south toward France, where language and culture feel familiar, the same way a sibling might watch a favored cousin. Meanwhile, Brussels stands apart, 2 million people navigating both languages while mostly speaking French. It's nominally shared, practically independent. And it's globally symbolic, diplomats everywhere, decisions for the continent debated daily. So if Belgium splits, what happens to that city? Neither region owns it cleanly, yet it's too valuable for either to lose. Here's where the fantasy of clean separation meets the reality of international logistics. You can't just draw a line through Brussels without cutting the nerve center of Europe. The EU Commission, NATO command, countless embassies, everyone depends on Belgian neutrality. If the country disintegrates, the shock won't stop at its borders. It'll rattle the institutions housed within, forcing discussions about relocation, jurisdiction, even membership. Imagine the EU debating whether its own host nation still legally exists. But from the Flemish perspective, the cost of staying together may already outweigh the risks of breaking apart. They see themselves as footing the bill for inefficiency born elsewhere, their economy bound by compromise. Independence, or at least a confederation model, looks like emancipation. They'd keep their money, their language, their policies. Wallonia would be free to align with France or reinvent itself. Brussels could become an international enclave, a kind of European district much like Washington, D.C., pledged to both but controlled by neither. It sounds tidy, it never is, because beneath the politics lies identity. Families live across the internal border, workers commute daily between regions. 1/3 of Brussels' workforce comes from outside its limits. Split the country and those morning commutes suddenly cross foreign territory. Taxes, social security, healthcare, all would have to be reinvented. That's not separation, that's open heart surgery. And then there's energy and migration, two issues that show how fragile national cohesion has become. In 2024, asylum applications climbed above 40,000, stressing infrastructure unevenly across regions. Integration policies diverged, fueling suspicion between governments that already distrust each other. Meanwhile, energy debates, especially over Russian gas and nuclear policy, turned technical questions into regional identity tests. When the lights flicker, someone wants to know whose grid failed. To outside observers, Belgium looks stable. Quiet streets, full cafes, cautious politicians. But talk to locals and you'll hear fatigue, a sense of carrying a system designed for another century. The joke goes that Belgium proves federalism can stretch infinitely, but the laughter is thinner now. Because what if the stretching has already reached its limit? Foreign diplomats whisper about soft separation, where autonomy becomes so total that the central government fades to ceremony. That's not theoretical. Most core powers, education, culture, welfare, are already regionalized. The federal layer hangs above them, thin and ceremonial, like the frosting on a cake split clean down the middle. Still, watch closely and you'll notice something deeper. Both sides believe they represent modern Europe. Flanders claims efficiency and merit. Wallonia insists solidarity and social rights. Maybe the truth is that Belgium itself became a metaphor, the tension between unity and diversity that defines the entire continent, which makes the prospect of its breakup more than just a domestic affair. If Belgium can't survive difference, what does that say about Europe's grand experiment a few blocks away? Of course, the breakup isn't official. No referendum, no partition treaty, just momentum building slowly, pulled by markets and mindsets rather than militias. Belgium doesn't need war to dissolve. It could simply drift apart, pieces functioning independently until no one remembers when they were attached. A quiet fade instead of a violent shatter. And maybe that's how modern countries die now, not with invasions, but with spreadsheets and stalled meetings. The borders stay on paper long after meaning disappears. Flanders keeps doing business with Germany. Wallonia negotiates subsidies with Paris. Brussels remains a diplomatic island, legally Belgian, practically European. Look at the next edition of the world map. Belgium will still be there, same outline, same capital dot. But behind that line, the glue is thinning. The country that once proved compromise could hold anything together is slowly proving the opposite. And Belgium isn't the only place whose geography makes unity impossible. 847 words. Yemen, a nation split by its resources. There are countries that fight over politics, and then there's Yemen, a place where the battlefield is literally carved along the veins of its own land. From the mountains of the northwest to the oil fields of Marib, every inch of terrain decides who eats, who governs, and who survives. The map says Yemen singular, but on the ground that word has been plural for years. The story of Yemen's unraveling begins not with ideology but with geography. The north is rugged, mountains rising over 9,000 feet, villages clinging to cliffs, defensible and insular. The south, stretched along the coast, looks outward toward the sea and the world beyond. It's there around Aden that British influence once shaped a distinct identity, more cosmopolitan, more maritime. Two countries existed before, North and South Yemen. They united in 199, but the terrain never agreed with the paperwork. Fast forward to 2014, when the Houthi movement swept out of the northern mountains and seized the capital, Sana'a. Suddenly the country was split again, Houthis in the north, the recognized government forced south to Aden, and a Saudi-led coalition launching a bombing campaign to restore control. 8 years of airstrikes followed, more than 25,000 by some counts. The north hardened under siege, while the south became a patchwork of militias, separatists, and foreign interests. The map's single outline blurred into gray zones that even locals struggled to name. At the center of everything lies Marib, an oil-rich province in the middle of the desert. Whoever controls Marib controls the cash flow that keeps their side alive. For years, both forces have fought over it, sending waves of fighters across sand and scrubland just to capture refineries and pipelines. The geography turns each offensive into a logistical nightmare. Scorching heat by day, freezing cold by night, few roads, and even fewer friends. Yet the risk is worth it, because those oil fields fund the war that decides Yemen's political future. But oil isn't the only prize. The Tahama coastal plain, Yemen's breadbasket, once produced most of the nation's food. Now it's a wasteland scarred by craters and famine. Blocks on imports, destroyed irrigation, and failed rains have left millions on the brink of starvation. People risk sniper fire just to fetch water from broken wells. Geography once fed Yemen, now it's starving it. Meanwhile, in the south, the Southern Transitional Council, the STC, controls much of Aden and the surrounding coast. Their goal isn't just autonomy, it's resurrection, the rebirth of South Yemen as a separate state. They even fly the old flag, red and blue, under a single star. To them, unity failed. And the people who remember pre-199 independence say the map should never have changed in the first place. From above, satellites show a divided nation. Green mountains in the north lit by scarce nighttime electricity, brown deserts cut by front lines, and blue ports guarded by warships. Those ships belong mostly to outside powers. Saudi Arabia and the UAE back different factions. Iran arms and supports the Houthis. It's become a continental chessboard with Yemen as the sacrificial square. Each outside player chases influence and resources, using local terrain as their playing field. This external tug-of-war mirrors older history. Think back to Sudan before it split, or Libya after Gaddafi fell. In each case, oil underground magnified every political fault above. Yemen fits that pattern almost perfectly. The north controls territory, the south controls the sea. Both need the resources of the other, but neither trusts enough to share them. Each alliance is temporary, every ceasefire is brittle. The human toll is staggering, 19,000 civilian deaths. More than 2/3 of the population relying on food aid, whole generations who have never known peace. But what makes Yemen's story different is its geography's active role in sustaining the division. The mountains shield the Houthis from invasion. The open south favors armored columns and coastal supply lines from foreign patrons. Nature itself draws a frontier tougher than any border fence. If you look closely at the modern map, you'll see Sana'a marked with a small circle labeled capital. But functionally, Yemen has several capitals now. Aden in the south, seat of the nominal government. Sana'a in the north, stronghold of the Houthis. Mukalla and Sayyan in the east, run by local militias or tribes. Each issues its own bureaucratic stamps, its own taxes, its own checkpoints. The cartographers can't keep up. The conflict even rewired identity. Ask a northerner who they are and you might hear Zaidi, one of Yemen's main Shia branches. Ask a southerner and you'll hear Hadrami or Adani. These aren't just sects, their geographies turned into tribes of destiny. When environmental collapse hits, they survive locally, not nationally. That's how countries fade. People stop referring to the larger shape and start clinging to the terrain that still sustains them. Water scarcity deepens the fracture. Centuries of fragile agriculture depended on mountain terraces and seasonal monsoons. Now drought, overuse, and population growth have drained aquifers faster than warheads ever could. The capital once relied on wells that now sit dry. In some places, water trucking costs more than food. When scarcity meets inequality, rebellion becomes self-reinforcing. The next conflict might not be over oil, it might be over what's left to drink. Peace talks try to reassemble Yemen on paper. Committees meeting in Geneva, in Riyadh, in Muscat. But each plan crashes against geography. How do you reunify a country whose economy, society, and terrain all reward division? Even if guns fall silent, borders drawn by cliffs and oil wells remain. And every local commander who learned to profit from the chaos has no interest in another central government taking his territory away. In truth, there may be no going back to a singular Yemen. The landscape itself now resists it. The north will likely consolidate under Houthi administration, a quasi-state recognized by few but functioning in practice. The south may move toward autonomy backed by foreign money and coastal trade. Between them, a stretch of desert policed by shifting alliances, essentially a void. Some call this a temporary ceasefire line. Others quietly treat it as the birth of two nations. History suggests that once geography chooses, politics follows. Sudan did it, Yemen might be next. And yet, look again at that map hanging in classrooms or news reports. It still shows one bold outline labeled Yemen. The truth is harder to draw, a mosaic of mountains, deserts, and oil fields, none willing to share the same flag. So when we say Yemen might cease to exist, we don't mean its people will vanish. We mean the idea of Yemen, the single, unified state, already has. What's left are fragments chasing their own futures, divided by the same ground that once bound them together. Whether the world accepts that fragmentation or pretends the old borders can be restored will decide which map survives, the one in archives or the one now forming in sand and blood. Sudan, the state that split and might split again. In 2011, the world watched as Sudan shrank. The new border between North and South wasn't just a political line, it was an acknowledgement that geography had finally won. After decades of civil war, millions dead, and countless promises broken, South Sudan became the world's youngest country. For a brief moment, it looked like peace had been traded for partition. But the ink hadn't even dried on the new maps before the next fractures began to form. To understand why Sudan keeps breaking, you have to look at what it's built on and what it is. The north is mostly desert, a vast expanse of dust and stone shaped by the Nile, where life clings to the riverbanks like moss around a vein. The south, now across another border, is rich with oil, water, and green. The separation line was drawn through those resources like a scar, giving each side part of what the other needed, and ensuring neither could truly thrive alone. It's the geographical equivalent of ripping a body in half and letting each half fight for the heart. After the 2011 secession, Khartoum lost almost 3/4 of its oil revenue overnight. The pumps, ports, and pipelines that once fed its budget now lay inside an independent country that still relied on the North's refineries and infrastructure. Trade didn't stop, but trust did. Arguments over transit fees, border control, and oil-sharing treaties resurfaced almost instantly, proving the split solved geography with politics but ignored economics. Meanwhile, inside what was left of Sudan, other divisions began to boil over. Darfur, the western region that had already endured genocide and displacement, never truly stabilized. Blue Nile and South Kordofan continued to host rebel movements demanding autonomy. The same logic that ended one civil war, let those who feel different go their own way, echoed through every corner. And suddenly the question wasn't whether Sudan could hold together, but which piece would leave next. In 2019, the military removed Omar al-Bashir, the dictator who'd controlled the country for 3 decades. Crowds filled the streets of Khartoum chanting for freedom and democracy. But after the cheering faded, 2 rival generals stepped into the power vacuum. Abdel Fattah al-Burhan for the army, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, Hemedti, for the rapid support forces. The partnership lasted just long enough for both men to realize they couldn't share a country either. By 2023, Sudan was back at war with itself. Different players, same pattern. Look closer and you'll see geography quietly directing the script again. The army holds the central riverine region, rich with farmland and bureaucratic control. The RSF came from the arid west, where migration routes and gold mines fund militias and maintain loyalty. 2 landscapes, 2 economies, 2 versions of power. One draws its strength from the Nile, the other from the desert. The fight isn't ideological, it's ecological. Control the roots, control survival. In a country this large, twice the size of France, distance itself becomes an enemy. The desert swallows roads. Communications fade beyond a few hundred miles. When Khartoum burns, half the country doesn't even see the smoke. Each province lives semi-independently out of necessity. Combine that with ethnic diversity, hundreds of groups, dozens of languages, and nationhood starts to look like wishful thinking held together by uniforms and fuel shortages. And then there's water. For centuries, the Nile has been both Sudan's gift and its curse. 95% of the population lives within a few dozen kilometers of it. Climate change is tightening that grip, bringing stronger droughts and unpredictable floods. Upstream, Ethiopia's massive Grand Renaissance Dam is altering the flow, threatening to weaken Sudan's irrigation cycles. If the water runs short, agriculture, the only stable income outside oil, collapses. When countries rely on one river and that river changes, politics become hydrology by another name. Neighboring states know this. Egypt watches Sudan's instability like someone living downstream from a broken dam. Ethiopia eyes the eastern border, where shared ethnic groups ignore the frontier entirely. South Sudan trades oil through northern ports but keeps one hand on the pipeline's shut-off valve. Every neighbor has a stake in what happens. Sudan's fragmentation could redraw half the map of East Africa, and none of those new lines would be peaceful. The humanitarian cost today rivals Syria's. Millions displaced, cities without electricity or hospitals, hunger spreading through camps where aid can't reach because no one controls the roads. The UN calls it one of the world's worst crises, but numbers can't explain what's happening. A state hollowing out, its institutions retreating behind armed factions who care less about flags than funding. When people flee, they take their identities with them. And when enough people do that, the state itself evaporates. Look at Darfur again, the so-called periphery that never stopped burning. The same militias once accused of genocide now operate as independent warlords. In the absence of governance, old tribal councils and local armies command what's left of authority. Some regions trade with Chad more easily than with the rest of Sudan. To many there, the capital is a distant rumor. You can't expect unity in a country where roads function better as escape routes than connections. Peace agreements have come and gone, the 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement, the later Juba negotiations, but none address the physical layout that makes administration nearly impossible. To govern Sudan effectively, you'd need either omnipresence or teleportation. Terrain beats bureaucracy every time. The hills of the Nuba, the dunes of Darfur, the empty gap between city clusters, each slows supply lines, weakens cohesion, and invites rebellion. And even if the guns fall silent, what remains? Oil reserves that are depleting, farmland drying out, gold fueling smuggling networks instead of budgets, a population half under 30 with no reason to believe in national identity. Geography built a house too spacious to police and too poor to maintain. Politics simply handed out eviction notices. Now whispers grow louder about a second partition, multiple Sudans emerging where one used to be, Darfur autonomous again, the East seeking its own authority, Central Sudan clinging to the Nile like an island. Technically, they might form a loose confederation. Realistically, they might not speak to one another at all. If that happens, the world will act surprised, but it shouldn't. The first split in 2011 didn't end an old pattern, it confirmed it. Sudan has always been multiple ecosystems forced under one banner, desert, savanna, and river competing for dominance. You can force them to share a name, but not a destiny. So when someone claims Sudan is collapsing, they're using the wrong metaphor. It isn't falling, it's reverting. Returning to the mosaic the mapmakers tried to simplify, like a cracked clay pot dissolving back into the soil it came from. The outlines we drew were temporary, the terrains underneath permanent. And as war and drought repeat their lessons, Sudan is teaching the same truth its map once ignored. You can divide a country from its people, but you can't divide people from their geography. The Maldives paradise that's physically disappearing. If you've ever seen a postcard of paradise, a turquoise lagoon, overwater bungalows, coral framed by perfect sunlight, you've seen the Maldives. What that postcard never tells you is that it's also a countdown. Because beneath those calm blue waves lies a clock ticking louder every year, and the number it's counting down to is 0. The Maldives stands barely 1.5 meters above sea level. 80% of its islands sit lower than the average human height. For now, the water laps at the beaches politely, but the tide line keeps creeping forward. What used to flood once in a lifetime now floods every season. 90% of the islands report annual flooding, and almost all of them are eroding, losing the sand their entire existence depends on. Picture 515,000 people spread across tiny fragments of coral, 188 inhabited islands scattered like beads across the Indian Ocean. The capital, Malé, looks like a city built on a rooftop, dense, vertical, crowded to the edge. There's no room left to expand, no hill to climb when the ocean rises another half meter. So when the storms hit, there's nowhere to go but the water. By 203, the nation's own environmental reports expect 1 in 100-year floods to occur almost annually. That means schools, hospitals, power stations, all the things that define a functioning state are within the splash zone. 44% of settlements and more than 80% of critical infrastructure lie within 100 meters of the shore. The sea doesn't need to conquer the Maldives, it just needs to stand still and wait. The government calls it a climate emergency. For Maldivians, it's not a slogan, it's Tuesday. Every monsoon season, roads turn into rivers, wells fill with saltwater, crops rot. People have already relocated from disappearing islands to larger ones, carrying whatever they can before their homes wash away. On satellite images, entire neighborhoods look fuzzy at the edges where waves have chewed the land thin. The health impacts sit quietly in the background. Heat illnesses climbing, dengue fever spreading, drinking water becoming brackish. Doctors warn that every 1-degree rise in temperature pushes up stillbirth and premature birth rates by about 5%. But statistics can't measure what happens when a child grows up never expecting their island to last their lifetime. Economically, the nation leans heavily on tourism, 30% of GDP, much more in practice. The same beaches that feed families are vanishing step by step, while resorts spend millions building seawalls that slow erosion for a few more seasons. This is climate triage disguised as hospitality infrastructure. You can book a week in paradise, but under the villa someone's pumping sand to keep your floor above the tide. And yet the Maldives isn't surrendering. In 2021, it passed a Climate Emergency Act declaring that the right to a safe environment is a human right. It joined the UN's early warnings for all program to build nationwide alert systems by 2027. At COP28, the president promised to plant 5 million trees, an act equal parts adaptation and defiance, a statement that if the sea wants their land, it'll have to fight roots as well as waves. There's also land reclamation, dredging sand from the seabed to create higher islands. Hulhumalay near the capital is one of those artificial expansions designed to house future climate migrants from lower atolls. It's an engineering marvel, but the trade-off is brutal. Dredging damages coral reefs, the natural barriers that once protected those same islands from storms. Save people, lose coral. Save coral, lose people. Geography doesn't negotiate. Inside living rooms across the atolls, conversations have shifted from if to when. Parents debate moving their children to the capital. Others look to Sri Lanka or India, but political pride runs deep. To leave is to risk letting the sea claim victory over culture. So they keep adapting, building breakwaters, elevating houses, praying for another calm year. Still, no adaptation plan can escape the numbers. Scientists estimate that with current rates of warming, up to 95% of the islands could face complete inundation by the end of the century. For a nation with an average elevation of 1.5 meters, that's not a long horizon, it's a single generation. The government's approach mixes resilience with innovation. Officials have begun digitizing archives, land records, cultural materials, an idea borrowed from neighboring Tuvalu's concept of a digital nation. The thinking goes like this: even if the land disappears, the identity doesn't have to. A Maldivian passport, laws, and history could survive online, stored on servers long after the soil they describe sinks away. It's surreal but practical, a modern Noah's Ark made of code. Yet survival in the cloud doesn't solve what happens on the ground. Half of Malay's housing sits within 100 meters of the coast. Adding storm drains or higher foundations buys time, not permanence. Water treatment plants sit next to the sea. A single storm surge can poison them for months. Energy grids corrode in salt air. Insurance models don't even have categories for country at risk of vanishing entirely. For all its vulnerability, the Maldives stands as a moral compass at every climate negotiation. Its diplomats speak louder than its size should allow. They remind the world that it produces 0.003% of global emissions, basically nothing, but pays one of the highest prices. When they take the podium at the UN, they're not pleading for sympathy, they're issuing a preview. What's happening there will happen elsewhere, just slower. Walk through Malay at dusk and you'll hear the sea before you see it, the endless heartbeat of waves slapping concrete. Kids still play football on the beach. Tourists take sunset photos that look eternal, but locals count tides the way others count days. High water isn't an event anymore.